Leah Marshall was running late once again as she pulled up in front of the New Orleans courthouse. Glancing at the clock on the dashboard of her sedan, she noted with growing apprehension that there were only 10 minutes remaining until the trial was scheduled to begin. Her heart pounded faster as she realized that this was the day she had both dreaded and prepared for with meticulous care. Today marked the opening day of a high-profile case, one that could forever alter the manner in which racial profiling was handled in Louisiana. Taking a deep breath, Leah stepped out of her car. As an accomplished black judge, she had navigated a long history of adversity within the legal world, yet the weight of this particular case felt uniquely personal. The defendant, a young black man named Kevin Daniels, had been arrested without cause in his own neighborhood. The officer responsible for detaining him had claimed that he fit the description of someone involved in suspicious activity, a claim that sounded all too familiar, and disturbingly so. Determined, Leah strode across the parking lot. The steady click of her heels on the pavement echoed her resolve. Rather than entering through the grand, heavily publicized entrance, Leah chose the side door of the courthouse. The main steps were swarmed with reporters, cameras flashing and microphones poised to capture every moment of what was being billed as the story of the day. With no time to spare for the media frenzy, she made her way directly toward the side entrance. As she approached, she noticed a young white police officer standing at his post, his posture rigid and his eyes locked on her every move. Reaching for the ID badge that habitually hung from her neck, Leah intended to follow her usual routine before entering the building. However, before she could even present her credentials, the officer stepped forward and blocked her path. "Ma'am, I need to see some identification," he said sharply. Taken aback, Leah raised her eyebrows. "I'm Judge Marshall," she replied, lifting her badge higher so he could clearly see it. "I'm presiding over the Daniels case this morning." The officer did not even spare a glance at her badge. His eyes, cold and calculating, swept over her as if he were scrutinizing her very soul. A familiar burn of anger flared within Leah, yet she forced herself to remain composed. "There's been an incident nearby, and you match the description of someone involved. I'm going to need you to answer a few questions," he continued, his tone laced with suspicion. Leah stared at him for a long, silent moment, trying to process the unfolding scene. The irony was almost unbearable. Here she was, about to oversee a trial centered on racial profiling, yet she herself was being racially profiled at the very doors of the courthouse. "Officer," she said steadily, though she could feel her pulse quickening. "I don't have time for this. The trial starts in less than 10 minutes, and I need to get inside." Once more she extended her badge, silently urging him to recognize his mistake. But the officer remained unmoved. His hand hovered near his belt, close to the handcuffs clipped there, as he snapped, "I don't care who you say you are, ma'am. You're gonna have to come with me." Leah's breath hitched. This situation was escalating far too quickly. In his eyes, she saw the all-too-familiar expression of suspicion and contempt, the same look that had haunted her memories from her childhood in the South. It wasn't about her position as a judge, it was about her being black. Before she could protest further, another voice cut through the charged atmosphere. "What's going on here?" an older black officer asked as he approached. His face bore a mix of surprise and concern as he came to stand beside her. Recognizing him, Leah managed a tight, controlled reply. "Judge Marshall." "Judge Marshall, yes," Leah, the older officer, confirmed, his voice measured. He then shot a disapproving glance at the younger officer and commanded, "Stand down!" The younger officer, still fuming, mumbled under his breath, "She matches the description," as if speaking more to himself than anyone else. "That's the judge," the older officer snapped. "Do you want to lose your job?" The younger man grumbled again, then reluctantly stepped back. Forcing herself to breathe deeply, Leah knew that losing her temper would only lend further credence to his baseless accusations. "Are you all right, ma'am?" the older officer asked, his tone softening as he looked directly at her. Leah nodded, though her jaw remained clenched. "I'm fine, thank you," she replied curtly before turning and entering the courthouse. Her heart continued to race, and as she walked along the sterile, familiar halls, the disconcerting scene at the entrance replayed over and over in her mind. Leah had endured racism throughout her life, but to experience it so directly on the day of such an important trial felt almost too much to bear. Soon the courtroom fell silent as she banged her gavel to call the room to order. The trial commenced smoothly with opening statements from both sides, yet even as she listened, her mind kept drifting back to the officer's sneering face outside. The way he had instantly judged her. The connection between that encounter and the case before her felt inescapable. Then, the first witness was called, Kevin Daniels himself. As he took the stand, Leah leaned forward, her expression intent. His testimony was raw and painful. Kevin described how he had been stopped by the police simply for walking in his own neighborhood. He had done nothing wrong, hadn't even acted suspiciously, yet he was treated as though he were a criminal, handcuffed and humiliated in front of his neighbors. His words carried a heavy truth that resonated with the countless similar stories Leah had heard over the years. But today, his account hit differently. It was not just about Kevin Daniels. It was about all those whose voices had been silenced by prejudice. Midway through his testimony, the door at the back of the courtroom creaked open, and Leah's heart sank. The young officer from earlier, the one who had stopped her, entered the room. He made his way toward the witness stand, his face pale and tense. Every nerve in Leah's body tensed as she watched him approach. The prosecutor then announced, "We would like to call Officer Bill Wilkins to the stand." Before Leah could even register his name, she saw him take the stand with movements that were stiff and awkward. Despite her professional duty to remain impartial, it was nearly impossible not to recall how this was the same man who had looked at her not as the esteemed judge she was, but as a suspect. As Wilkins shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable, the prosecutor began questioning him about his role in Kevin Daniels' arrest. "I was patrolling the neighborhood when I saw Daniels," Wilkins stammered, his voice lacking the earlier confidence. It was as if he appeared out of place, a man who did not belong in that courtroom. Leah's grip on her gavel tightened. The phrase, "looked out of place," echoed in her mind, a phrase that, all too often, had been code for, "He's black, and I didn't think he should be there." The prosecutor pressed further in a sharp tone. "What exactly made Mr. Daniels look out of place?" Officer Wilkins fidgeted in his seat, his eyes darting about nervously, as if he were trying to conceal something. Leah's anger flared anew. She had thoroughly reviewed the case file. Kevin Daniels had simply been waiting for his ride share. There was no crime, no suspicious behavior, only the painful reality of being a black man in the wrong place at the wrong time in the eyes of the police. "Did you find anything on Mr. Daniels that suggested he had committed a crime?" the prosecutor demanded. Wilkins hesitated, his face flushing. "No," he finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "We didn't." For a long moment the room was enveloped in a silence so thick it seemed almost palpable. Leah's eyes scanned the jury. Some faces appeared moved by the truth of the matter, while others seemed caught in conflicted thought, but there was no denying the fact. That day, Kevin Daniels had been arrested solely because he was black. As Wilkins continued, his narrative began to unravel with each successive question. Inconsistencies in his account emerged, and his version of events crumbled under the scrutiny of the prosecutor's relentless questioning. Leah watched him closely, noting the way his eyes kept flickering toward her, a silent admission that he now knew exactly who she was and, implicitly, what he had done. When the prosecutor finally finished, Wilkins looked diminished, a mere shadow of the man who had once attempted to detain her outside the courthouse. Though Leah felt no sympathy for him, she was acutely aware of the larger implications of his testimony. This was not just about one officer. It was about a system that had long allowed individuals like Wilkins to operate unchecked. Throughout the trial, Leah fought to maintain her composure. She had a duty to remain neutral, to ensure that justice was served, yet the parallels between her own experience and the case at hand were impossible to ignore. As the day drew to a close, the courtroom buzzed with a tension that was nearly tangible. The defense attorney made his closing statements, attempting to portray Wilkins as a well-meaning officer who had simply made an honest mistake. However, both Leah and the prosecuting attorney, Samantha Green, knew the truth lay far deeper. Rising for her final argument, Samantha addressed the jury with a steady, powerful voice. This case is not just about Kevin Daniels. It is about a pattern we have witnessed far too often in our justice system. It is about officers like Bill Wilkins who, upon seeing a young black man in a neighborhood, assume he must be up to no good. That assumption leads to wrongful arrests, to public humiliation, and to deep-seated injustice. Today, we say enough is enough. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence as her words sank in. In that moment, the shift in the room was unmistakable. After the trial, Leah dismissed the courtroom for the day, yet she lingered at the bench, her mind a tumult of thoughts. She had fulfilled her duty and presided over the case fairly, but the earlier encounter outside the courthouse continued to haunt her. It served as a stark reminder that no matter how high her position or how many accomplishments she had achieved, she would always be seen through the distorted lens of race. Unexpectedly, the door to the courtroom opened, and Sergeant Michael Harris, the older officer who had intervened earlier, stepped inside. His face was etched with concern as he quietly approached the bench. "Judge Marshall," he said softly, "may I have a word?" Leah looked up, surprised by his sudden presence. "Of course, Harris," she replied, glancing around to ensure they were alone. Harris settled into the seat before her, folding his hands in front of him. "I wanted to speak with you about what happened earlier with Wilkins. I know he is not a bad kid, but he has blind spots, like many others do." Leah met his gaze, her expression unreadable as she repeated the words with a note of bitterness. "Blind spots, you mean racism?" Harris winced slightly but did not argue. "Maybe, probably. But I want you to know that I am trying to change things from within." Leah studied him for a long moment. She desperately wanted to believe in the possibility of real change, to trust that the system could evolve from within. But after everything she had witnessed and experienced, hope was a fragile commodity. "What do you suggest I do?" she asked quietly. "When I am sitting here day after day, hearing cases like this, and knowing firsthand what I have endured, it feels like the burden is too heavy." Harris fell silent for a long moment before finally answering. "Judge, you keep doing what you're doing. You hold people accountable, and that is the only way things are going to change." Leah nodded slowly, the weight of responsibility pressing heavily on her shoulders. The trial was not over yet, and many battles still lay ahead, but at least for that day a small step forward had been taken. As Harris left the room, Leah looked around the now empty courtroom, aware that the fight for justice was far from over. Yet, in that moment, she allowed herself to believe that justice had at last been served. A start, if nothing more. The following morning, the atmosphere inside the courthouse was thick with anticipation. The jury had spent the entire night in deliberation, and today would bring their decision. In her chambers, Leah sat, trying to steady her racing heart while preparing for what would be a pivotal moment, not only for the case at hand, but for many who had been following the trial with bated breath. This was more than a mere wrongful arrest. It was a defining moment in the struggle against systemic injustice and racial bias. Leah sipped her coffee and stared at the files spread across her desk. Beyond the walls of her office, she could hear the muffled sounds of reporters and protesters gathering near the courthouse. This case had evolved into something far larger than a local story. It had become a symbol of the deep-rooted systemic racism that still plagued law enforcement across the country. Her thoughts drifted back to the events of the previous day. Bill Wilkins, the officer who had profiled her at the courthouse, had sat in that courtroom earlier, clearly shaken. His testimony had the power to dismantle the very system he was a part of. And for every courtroom where justice was served, Leah knew there were countless others whose voices had never been heard. A sudden knock on her door snapped Leah back to reality. "Come in," she called, her voice steadier than she felt. Her clerk, Emily, entered holding a folder. "The jury's ready," she said softly. Nodding, Leah rose from her chair, took a deep breath and smoothed her robe. "Let's do this," she said, her tone resolute as she made her way to the courtroom. The sound of her footsteps echoed down the corridor, and as she passed by familiar walls and echoes of past cases, she felt a determined calm settle over her. In the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Reporters filled the gallery with their pens poised and cameras ready, while the families of both Kevin Daniels and Officer Wilkins sat in the front rows, their faces etched with tension and anticipation. Leah took her place at the bench, briefly glancing at Kevin Daniels, who sat with his lawyer at the defense table. Although his expression was somber, there was a glimmer of hope in his eyes, a hope that justice would finally prevail and that the trial might be a catalyst for real change. Shifting her gaze, she then looked toward Bill Wilkins, who now appeared far less confident than before. His eyes darted nervously around the room, and for the first time since the trial began, he seemed small, a man who had finally come to terms with the consequences of his actions. Clearing her throat, Leah addressed the courtroom. "Please bring in the jury," she said, her voice echoing through the silent room. The doors opened and the 12 jurors filed in, each taking their seats with a solemn air. Leah watched them carefully, trying to read their expressions. While some wore clear signs of empathy, others remained impassive, their eyes fixed straight ahead. The jury foreman, a middle-aged woman with dark hair pulled back into a tight bun, clutched a slip of paper tightly in her hand. Leah nodded toward the foreman and asked, "Has the jury reached a verdict?" With trembling hands, the foreman unfolded the paper and said, "We have, Your Honor." Her voice trembled just enough to betray the gravity of the moment. "Please read the verdict," Leah instructed, her heart pounding even as she maintained a composed exterior. The foreman glanced at the paper before speaking in a firm tone. "In the case of Officer Bill Wilkins, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty of wrongful arrest and racial discrimination." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Leah glanced at Kevin Daniels, who sat frozen for a moment. His face remained blank before a wave of relief began to wash over him. His lawyer patted him reassuringly on the back, and soon Kevin's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, which he blinked away hastily. Turning her attention to Bill Wilkins, Leah saw him staring straight ahead, his face ashen and his hands clenched tightly together. The weight of the verdict was unmistakable. It had clearly hit him hard, and for a fleeting moment it appeared as though he might collapse under its burden. Banging her gavel once, Leah declared, "Court is adjourned," as the room began to stir, with reporters scrambling for the exits and people filing out in disarray. Bill suddenly stood and addressed her. "Your Honor," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. Leah paused and looked down at him. The courtroom fell silent once more, all eyes turning to the young officer. His face was visibly shaking, and his expression was one of deep regret as he struggled to find the right words. I need to say something," he began, swallowing hard. "I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was protecting the community, but I was wrong. I see now that I allowed my assumptions and prejudices to cloud my judgment, and I'm sorry." The silence in the room was deafening. Leah's breath caught in her throat as she absorbed his apology. It was an apology, sincere perhaps, but it could never undo the damage that had been done. In her mind, she recalled all the times she had experienced being unfairly judged, all the moments when she had been stopped for nothing more than being black. She met his eyes steadily and said, "Officer Wilkins, your apology is noted. However, the harm caused by your actions runs deep. It affects lives, families, and entire communities. I am sorry, but saying sorry does not fix that." Wilkins nodded, his head hanging in defeat. He made no further attempt to explain or justify his actions. He simply stood there, accepting the consequences of his actions. For the first time, Leah saw in his eyes a hint of understanding, a flicker of remorse that might someday lead to change. As the courtroom slowly emptied, Leah remained seated for a moment, watching as Kevin Daniels embraced his family, his face a mixture of relief and exhaustion. Bill Wilkins stood quietly by the exit, waiting to be escorted out, his guilt weighing heavily upon him. Leah's thoughts swirled. She had done her duty, upheld the law and presided fairly over the case, but she knew in her heart that this trial was only a drop in an immense ocean of injustice. For every Kevin Daniels who received a semblance of justice, there were countless others whose stories would never be heard, whose cases would never reach a courtroom. Suddenly, the door to the courtroom opened once more, and Sergeant Michael Harris reappeared. Leah looked up, surprised to see him. He approached her quietly, his face reflecting a mix of concern and something akin to hope. "Judge Marshall," he said softly, "may I have a word?" Leah gestured for him to sit, and as he did, she sensed the urgency in his tone. "I just wanted to say thank you," he began, "for handling this case the way you did. We need someone to hold us accountable, and the system needs accountability." Leah let out a long, measured breath. "I appreciate that, Sergeant Harris," she replied, "but it doesn't feel like enough. Today was just one case. There are so many more out there, so many people who do not get justice." Harris nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You're right," he said quietly. "That's why we have to keep pushing. Change will not happen overnight, but every step matters. Every case like this chips away at the larger problem." Leah fell silent, absorbing his words. She wanted to believe in the possibility of change, wanted to see a future where justice prevailed universally, but after everything she had experienced, hope was both precious and fragile. "Then what about officers like Wilkins?" she asked quietly. "What happens to those who have been taught to think in a certain way?" Harris sighed and admitted, "It's hard. There are many officers like him, but there are also others, like myself, who are trying to change things from the inside. I promise you, as long as I can, I will continue working to reform our system." Leah looked at him, seeing in his eyes both the weariness of long battles and the determination that mirrored her own. "You keep doing what you're doing, Sergeant," she said. "That is the only way we will see change, piece by piece." Harris offered a small, reassuring smile. "Piece by piece," he echoed, before rising to leave. Left alone in the quiet, empty courtroom, Leah sank back into her chair, her mind abuzz with the gravity of the day's events. The trial was over, but its impact was only beginning to unfold. For Leah, the fight for justice was not confined to the walls of the courthouse. It stretched far beyond, into communities that still suffered the consequences of a biased system. As she gathered her files and prepared to leave, a familiar yet unexpected voice interrupted her thoughts. It was Kevin Daniels, now accompanied by his attorney. His face, though worn with the strain of recent events, bore a calm determination. "Judge Marshall," he said softly, his voice low but steady, "I just wanted to say thank you for everything." Leah regarded him for a long moment, understanding the profound weight behind his words. "You don't need to thank me, Kevin," she replied. "I was simply doing my job." But Kevin shook his head, insisting, "No, it's more than that. This trial, it wasn't just about me. It was about showing people what really happens out there, about giving voice to those of us who are too often overlooked." Leah's chest tightened as she absorbed his meaning. "I hope this is a step toward change," she said carefully, each word chosen with the hope that it might inspire further progress. Kevin's eyes softened with understanding as he whispered, "I know it's only a start, but it's a start. And for that I'm grateful." As Kevin departed, his attorney close behind, Leah could not shake the sense that there was still so much more left to be done. One trial, one verdict. It was not enough to dismantle a system built over centuries. And yet, in that very moment, she knew that even the smallest steps could pave the way for a broader movement. With a heavy sigh, she began making her way back to her chambers. Her footsteps were slow and deliberate, and though the media had already swarmed the front entrance, she chose once again to exit through the side door, hoping to avoid the intrusive glare of cameras and microphones. No sooner had she pushed open the door than she found herself face to face with Officer Bill Wilkins. He was leaning against the wall, his face drawn and pale, his uniform hanging loosely as if it were too large to contain the weight of his guilt. Leah stopped dead in her tracks, her heart thudding loudly in her chest. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke, a mixture of guilt, anger, and confusion that filled the space like a heavy fog. Finally, Bill's voice broke the silence, rough and hesitant. "Judge Marshall, I didn't expect to see you here," he managed, his eyes meeting hers with a conflicted intensity. Leah remained silent, waiting for him to continue. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, each word laden with remorse, "about everything that happened today, about what I did to you." He paused, his hands fidgeting at his sides as he searched for the right words. "I know that saying sorry isn't enough. It won't fix what I did. But I need you to know that I never meant for any of this to happen." Leah's eyes narrowed as she listened. "You didn't mean for it to happen," she repeated coldly, echoing the sentiment she had heard too many times before. "But it did happen, Officer Wilkins, and it keeps happening to people like Kevin, to people like me. So, forgive me if I'm not moved by your remorse right now." Bill's expression remained fixed. He did not back down. "I know I screwed up. I know I let my biases take over, and I'm trying to understand and change that. But it's not as simple as unlearning years of conditioning overnight. I was taught to see things a certain way, and I didn't question it until now." Leah crossed her arms, her face still stern as she asked, "And what has changed? Is it simply the fact that you got caught, or is it that someone finally called you out on it?" Bill's silence was heavy, laden with the realization of his own shortcomings. He finally murmured, I don't know." Leah's voice remained calm but resolute. "We must face these truths if we ever hope to change this system," she said. "It isn't enough to be punished when we are caught. We need to address the very biases that drive us to make these mistakes in the first place." Bill looked down, his eyes reflecting a mixture of regret and a nascent understanding. "I'm trying, Judge," he whispered. "I really am." But Leah's voice cut through softly yet firmly. "Your apology, Officer Wilkins, is noted, but I need you to understand that for every apology there is a life that has been altered, a community that has been scarred. I cannot let this moment be forgotten." As the conversation dwindled, Sergeant Harris reappeared briefly to stand by and observe. "There are many like him," Harris said quietly, "but there are also those of us who continue to work for change from the inside. We must keep pushing, piece by piece." Leah nodded slowly, echoing his sentiment with a measured tone. Piece by piece. Once again, Bill and Leah stood in silence. A silence filled with the echoes of an institutional failure that spanned generations. Leah's heart was heavy, and yet, in that shared moment, there was also the faint glimmer of hope that recognition of wrongdoing might one day lead to true transformation. After a long moment that felt like an eternity, Leah turned away from Bill. The courtroom and the trial were behind her now, but the impact of the day's events would linger long into the future. The fight for justice was far from over, and while one verdict might signal a step forward, it was merely the beginning of a long, arduous journey toward systemic reform. Gathering her files and taking one last look at the courthouse, a building that had borne witness to both triumph and sorrow, Leah resolved to carry the lessons of the day with her. Every case, every trial, was a reminder of the work that lay ahead, a constant challenge to dismantle the deeply ingrained biases that continued to shape lives. With a determined sigh, she made her way back to her chambers, her footsteps echoing in the quiet corridor as the courthouse slowly returned to its routine after the uproar of the trial. In the solitude of her chambers, Leah sat down at her desk and reviewed the day's events. The faces of those who had been wronged, the harsh words exchanged in the courtroom, and the painful admissions of regret all swirled together in her mind. Yet, as she reflected on it all, she also found a measure of resolve. Today had shown that even in the midst of injustice, accountability was possible, and although the road ahead would be long and fraught with obstacles, every step taken was a step toward the change that so many desperately needed. As the hours passed and the courthouse lights dimmed for the night, Leah continued to pore over case files and legal briefs, preparing for the next day's challenges. Outside, the hum of the city continued unabated, a reminder that the struggle for justice was interwoven with the very fabric of everyday life. In that quiet moment, she made a silent promise to herself, to never let the weight of injustice deter her, but rather to use it as fuel to drive change, piece by piece.